Ethan stood in the master bathroom of his Austin home, staring at two pink lines on a pregnancy test he'd pulled from beneath crumpled tissues and an empty shampoo bottle. The air conditioning hummed through the vents, but he felt nothing except the cold realization washing over him. This test wasn't his. That much was obvious. He and Mallory hadn't been intimate in months. Every excuse she'd given, headaches, exhaustion from her downtown tech job, needing space, suddenly made perfect sense in the worst possible way. Here's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It hides in trash cans, in deleted text messages, in the small lies we tell ourselves aren't worth questioning. Most people think the hardest part of discovering infidelity is the initial shock. They're wrong. The hardest part is what comes after. The choice between explosive confrontation or cold, calculated strategy. Ethan chose the latter. In that moment, standing in the bathroom of the house they'd bought together off South Lamar, he made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't confront Mallory. Not yet. Instead, he would become an investigator in his own marriage, gathering evidence piece by piece until there was nowhere left for her to hide. Some might call this paranoia. Others might call it obsession. But when you've built a life with someone, when you've trusted them with your vulnerabilities and your future, you deserve the truth. The whole truth. Not the sanitized version they're willing to admit when cornered. Ethan was about to discover that his wife had been living an entirely separate existence, one that involved late-night meetings at cafes near the Capitol, expensive purchases he'd never seen, and a man named Luke who thought he could build a family on the ruins of someone else's life. This is the story of how one hidden pregnancy test in Austin, Texas, unraveled a web of lies so elaborate it would destroy multiple families, and how one man's quiet determination turned betrayal into justice. But it started with a simple question Ethan asked himself that morning. If she could hide this, what else had she hidden? Ethan replaced the pregnancy test exactly where he'd found it, his hand steadier than he expected. Years of working in tech had taught him patience, the value of documentation, the importance of having all the data before making decisions. He arranged the tissues and empty bottle with surgical precision, leaving no trace of his discovery. Then he walked downstairs to the kitchen, where morning light streamed through the windows overlooking their small backyard. The house suddenly felt like a stage set, beautiful but hollow. Mallory came down 20 minutes later, hair still damp from the shower, wearing one of those effortlessly chic outfits she always seemed to pull together. She poured coffee from the pot he'd made, scrolled through Instagram, and didn't look at him once. The casual indifference stung more than anger would have. "Long day at work today?" he asked, keeping his voice light and conversational. She glanced up briefly, her expression unreadable. The usual. Meetings, deadlines. You know how it is. The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly it might have been truth. He studied her face, looking for signs of guilt or nervousness, but Mallory was a master at composure. That's what had attracted him to her in the first place. Her poise, her confidence, the way she navigated the world like she owned it. Now those same qualities felt like weapons aimed directly at him. She mentioned something about a team dinner that might run late, another evening where she'd be unreachable, another night where the house would be his alone. Ethan nodded and smiled, playing the role of the understanding husband while his mind cataloged every detail. After she left, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time, coffee growing cold in his mug. The AC cycled on and off. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the street. Normal sounds in a life that had just become anything but normal. He pulled out his phone and began making notes. Times, dates, inconsistencies in her stories over the past few months. The late nights at the office had started around February. The sudden interest in new clothes and expensive candles had been March. The complete withdrawal from physical intimacy had been gradual but absolute, starting around January. He was building a timeline now, and it painted a picture he wished he couldn't see. But Ethan had always believed in facing reality, no matter how painful. And the reality was this. His marriage had been dying for months while he'd been too trusting to notice. What comes next when the person you trusted most becomes a stranger in your own home? The following morning, Ethan called in sick to his job at a software company near Domain Northside. He needed time, space, and privacy to dig deeper. Once Mallory's white SUV disappeared down the street toward Mopac, he moved through the house like an archaeologist examining ruins. He started with the obvious places: her nightstand, her home office, the stack of receipts she kept in a kitchen drawer. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions and added new layers to the mystery. There was a receipt from a boutique in the Arboretum dated 3 weeks ago. Luxury candles, silk lingerie, and men's cologne totaling over $300. He'd never seen any of these items in their house, which meant they'd gone somewhere else, to someone else. The cologne detail particularly burned. She'd bought gifts for another man using their joint credit card, assuming Ethan either wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. The audacity of it was almost impressive. He photographed the receipt with his phone, adding it to a growing digital folder he'd labeled Evidence. Next came her laptop, left carelessly on the dining room table. Mallory had always been comfortable with technology but lazy about security. Her password was their wedding anniversary, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on him. Within minutes, he had access to her email and calendar. The emails from someone named Luke R. started appearing around January, initially professional, but gradually shifting to something more personal. Inside jokes about their boss, lunch invitations that became coffee meetings. The messages weren't explicitly romantic, but the familiarity between them was obvious. These weren't the emails of casual co-workers, but it was her calendar that provided the smoking gun. Among work meetings and project deadlines was an entry for the following Friday. Dr. Carlson, prenatal checkup, 3 p.m. Ethan stared at those words until they blurred. She was actively managing a pregnancy behind his back, seeing doctors, making plans for a future that didn't include him except as a convenient cover story. The methodical nature of her deception was what shocked him most. This wasn't a spontaneous mistake or a moment of weakness. This was calculated, organized, and ongoing. Mallory had been building an entire parallel life, and she'd been confident enough in his obliviousness that she hadn't even bothered to hide it well. How do you confront someone who's been living a lie so complete they've scheduled their betrayal in a calendar app? That evening, Mallory came home carrying takeout bags from their favorite barbecue place off 6th Street. She kissed his cheek and unpacked brisket and mac and cheese, playing the role of thoughtful wife who wanted to surprise her hard-working husband. Ethan watched her performance with a strange detachment, like he was observing a character in a movie rather than the woman he'd married. "I got your favorite," she said brightly, arranging boxes on the kitchen counter. "Figured we could have a nice dinner together. You've been working so hard lately." The irony of her words almost made him laugh. He'd been working hard, yes, but not at his job. He'd been working hard at uncovering her secrets, at documenting her betrayal, at building a case that would leave no room for denial or manipulation. But he kept his face neutral, thanked her for the food, and settled in for what he knew would be a carefully choreographed evening of normalcy. They ate at the dining room table, talking about nothing important, a coworker's annoying habits, a funny video she'd seen online, plans for the weekend that would never happen. Midway through the meal, Ethan decided to test her. "How's the office these days?" he asked casually, spearing a piece of brisket. "You seem busier than ever." Mallory barely looked up from her phone. Same old grind. Deadlines, client meetings, the usual chaos. Her answer was smooth, practiced, completely false. He knew from her calendar that today had actually been light on meetings, with a 2-hour gap in the afternoon that was mysteriously unaccounted for. "Must be tough juggling everything," he continued, keeping his tone sympathetic. "All those late nights, early mornings, it's impressive how dedicated you are." Something flickered across her face, maybe pride, maybe guilt, maybe just annoyance at having to maintain the facade. "It's not that bad," she said. "Besides, I'm doing it for us, right? Building our future." The phrase "our future" landed like a punch. There was no "our future" anymore, only the elaborate fiction she'd constructed and the reckoning that was coming. Ethan nodded and smiled, playing his part, while underneath the surface his resolve hardened into something cold and immovable. Mallory had made her choices, and soon she'd face the consequences, but not yet. Not until he had every piece of evidence locked down tight, until there was no possible escape route for her to wiggle through. Patience, he reminded himself. Documentation. Strategy. When someone can lie to your face over barbecue and small talk, what does that say about the depth of their deception? Friday morning arrived with typical Austin humidity, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your back before you've even finished your coffee. Ethan had barely slept, his mind running through scenarios and contingencies like a computer algorithm searching for bugs. Today was the day of Mallory's prenatal appointment, and he'd decided weeks ago that he wouldn't just sit home wondering. He was going to follow her, see for himself. gather the kind of evidence that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as paranoid imagination. Mallory left the house at her usual time, dressed in a fitted dress he'd never seen before, paired with heels that clicked sharply against their hardwood floors. She looked polished, put together, like someone heading to an important meeting rather than a secret medical appointment. Ethan waited 5 minutes after her SUV disappeared, then got in his own car and headed toward the clinic address he'd pulled from her calendar. It was located in a newer development off Bee Cave Road, one of those generic medical plazas surrounded by chain restaurants and shopping centers. He parked a block away, far enough to avoid detection but close enough to have a clear view of the entrance. The wait felt endless. 10 minutes, 15, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Then Mallory's SUV pulled into the lot. She stepped out, checked her phone, adjusted her dress. Normal gestures, but there was something different about her body language, a kind of anticipation or nervousness he hadn't seen in months. She was meeting someone, he realized. And sure enough, within minutes, a man approached from the opposite side of the parking lot. He was tall, probably mid-30s, dressed in business casual with the kind of easy confidence that came from success and privilege. They embraced, not a casual hug, but something longer, more intimate, the kind of touch that spoke of familiarity and affection. Ethan's jaw clenched as he watched them walk into the clinic together side by side, looking for all the world like an excited couple preparing for their future child. He pulled out his phone and started recording through the car window, capturing every moment, every gesture, every damning detail. This was Luke. He knew it instinctively. This was the man who'd helped destroy his marriage, who'd decided that other people's vows and commitments were just obstacles to his own happiness. And in that moment, watching them disappear through the clinic doors, Ethan made a decision. Luke wouldn't walk away from this unscathed either. What kind of man shows up to another man's child's prenatal appointment without a shred of shame? Ethan sat in his car for what felt like hours, though the dashboard clock insisted it was only 40 minutes. When Mallory and Luke finally emerged from the clinic, they were laughing about something, heads close together in the kind of casual intimacy that comes from shared secrets and inside jokes. Luke reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Mallory's face, then leaned in to kiss her cheek. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned into it, smiling up at him like he was the center of her universe. The betrayal Ethan had known intellectually became visceral in that moment, a physical ache in his chest that made breathing difficult. But he didn't storm over there. He didn't shout or make a scene. Instead, he kept recording, capturing every damning second on video. Luke walked Mallory to her SUV, said something that made her laugh again, then headed to his own car, a sleek Lexus sedan with all the trappings of suburban success. Ethan quickly pulled up Luke's LinkedIn profile on his phone, something he'd researched days earlier. Luke Richardson, senior consultant at a high-end tech firm downtown, married with 2 kids, the kind of guy who posted family vacation photos and inspirational business quotes on social media. Perfect on the surface, rotten underneath, just like Mallory. After they drove away in separate directions, Ethan sat in his car reviewing the footage. The video was clear, undeniable, devastating. His wife walking into a prenatal clinic with another man, embracing him, laughing with him, planning a future that had nothing to do with Ethan except as a convenient cover story and financial safety net. The anger that had been simmering for weeks finally broke through his careful control, but he channeled it into something productive. He opened his notes app and began documenting everything. Timestamps, descriptions, context. This wasn't just about catching Mallory anymore. This was about ensuring that both she and Luke faced full consequences for their choices. On the drive home, Ethan's mind raced through possibilities. He could confront Mallory immediately, throw the evidence in her face, and kick her out. That would be satisfying in the short term, but might give her time to spin a story, to play the victim, to manipulate the narrative. Or he could keep playing the oblivious husband a little longer, letting her dig the hole deeper while he built an airtight case. The strategic part of him, the part that had built a successful career through careful planning and execution, knew that patience would yield better results. Let her think she was getting away with it. Let her confidence grow into carelessness. And then, when the time was right, he'd drop the hammer so hard there'd be no recovery, no excuses, no escape. Mallory wanted to play games? Fine. but she just made the critical mistake of underestimating her opponent. How long should you wait before exposing a betrayal when every day of silence feels like complicity in your own destruction? That evening, Mallory came home in high spirits, humming to herself as she set her purse on the kitchen counter. She seemed almost giddy, lighter than Ethan had seen her in months. The prenatal appointment had apparently gone well. Of course it had. She'd been there with the actual father, planning their future together while Ethan played the role of oblivious husband at home. "How was your day?" she asked, opening the refrigerator and surveying its contents like everything was perfectly normal. Her ability to compartmentalize was truly impressive. "Quiet," Ethan replied, keeping his voice neutral. "How about yours? Still buried in meetings?" He watched her face carefully, looking for any crack in her composure, any hint of guilt or nervousness. There was none. "You know how it is," she said with a casual shrug. "Put out one fire, 3 more pop up, but I'm managing." She pulled out ingredients for a salad, moving around the kitchen with the ease of someone who had nothing to hide. The performance was flawless, which made it all the more enraging. Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, studying her like a specimen under glass. "You seem happy," he observed. "Something good happen?" For a split second, just a fraction of a moment, her movements stuttered. Then she recovered with a bright smile. "Just relieved to have Friday almost over, I guess. Looking forward to the weekend." Another lie, smooth as silk. She had no idea he'd spent his afternoon watching her walk into a clinic with her lover. No idea that every word out of her mouth was being cataloged as additional evidence of her deception. The weekend passed in a fog of false domesticity. They watched Netflix together Saturday night, went to brunch on South Congress Sunday morning, maintained the illusion of a functioning marriage. But underneath the surface, Ethan was finalizing his strategy. He'd already sent an anonymous email to himself with all the evidence, photos, videos, calendar screenshots, receipts, just in case Mallory somehow discovered what he knew and tried to destroy the proof. He'd researched Luke's wife on social media, a woman named Christine who posted cheerful photos of her kids and looked genuinely happy in her perfectly curated suburban life. She had no idea her husband was planning a second family with another man's wife. Soon, Ethan decided, she would know everything. The question wasn't whether to expose them anymore. It was when and how to do maximum damage. Is it revenge if you're simply ensuring everyone knows the truth? Or does motive matter less than outcome? Monday morning, Ethan made his move. Not the final confrontation, but an important preliminary step. While Mallory was at work, he contacted a divorce attorney in downtown Austin, a woman with a reputation for aggressive representation and zero tolerance for infidelity. The consultation lasted 90 minutes and covered everything: Texas community property laws, proof of adultery, strategic timing for filing. "You've done your homework," the attorney, Sarah Martinez, said approvingly as she reviewed his evidence folder. "This is as clear-cut as they come. She won't have a leg to stand on." Sarah explained that Texas was one of the few states where adultery actually mattered in divorce proceedings, potentially affecting property division and spousal support. The video from the clinic, the emails, the receipts, all of it painted a picture of sustained deception that would be difficult for any judge to overlook. "The key," Sarah advised, "is controlling the narrative. Don't let her spin this into some story where you were neglectful or drove her into another man's arms. You've got the facts on your side. Use them." Ethan left her office feeling validated and strategic, like he'd just assembled the last pieces of a complex puzzle. But documentation wasn't enough for him anymore. He wanted Mallory to understand exactly what she'd done, wanted her to face the reality of her choices without the ability to deflect or manipulate. So he decided the confrontation needed to be public, not in a shouting match sense, but in a setting where she couldn't simply walk away or dismiss him. A restaurant, he decided, somewhere nice, where she'd feel obligated to maintain composure, where the social pressure of witnesses would force her to engage rather than deflect. He made reservations at an upscale Italian place downtown, the kind of spot they'd visited for anniversaries and special occasions. When he told Mallory about the dinner reservation that evening, she seemed genuinely pleased. "That's sweet of you," she said, kissing his cheek. "We haven't done something nice in a while." The irony was suffocating. She thought this was a romantic gesture, a sign that their marriage might be improving, when actually it was the setting for its public execution. Ethan smiled and agreed. letting her maintain the fantasy for a few more days. Saturday night, he told himself. Saturday night, everything would come crashing down, and Mallory would finally understand that her husband wasn't the naive fool she'd taken him for. The game was almost over, and she'd been playing it blind while he held all the cards. Does confrontation require an audience, or is it enough to simply speak truth directly to the person who's wronged you? Saturday arrived with typical Austin spring weather. Warm but not yet brutal, the kind of evening that made outdoor patios desirable. Mallory dressed carefully for dinner, choosing a deep red dress that Ethan had never seen before. Everything about her was new these days. Clothes, perfume, jewelry. Purchases he assumed were funded by their joint accounts but selected for Luke's benefit. She looked stunning, which only deepened his resolve. All that effort for a dinner where her carefully constructed world would implode. They drove downtown in relative silence, Mallory scrolling through her phone while Ethan navigated familiar streets. The restaurant was on 2nd Street, tucked between newer condos and renovated warehouses, the kind of place where Austin's tech money mingled with old Texas charm. The hostess seated them at a corner table with flickering candlelight and a view of the street outside. Perfect, Ethan thought. Intimate enough for a private conversation, but public enough that Mallory would feel constrained by social expectations. She ordered wine. He stuck with water. He needed to be clear-headed for what came next. The first course arrived, some kind of artisan bread with olive oil and balsamic. Mallory talked about her week, office gossip, upcoming projects, the usual surface-level conversation that had become their default mode. Ethan let her talk, nodding and responding with appropriate sounds while his hand rested on the phone in his pocket. He'd transferred the clinic video to his phone that afternoon, had it queued up and ready. All he needed was the right moment, the perfect opening to pull the pin on this particular grenade. That moment came when Mallory mentioned being tired, needing a vacation. Maybe they should plan something for summer. The audacity of suggesting they plan a future together when she was carrying another man's child finally pushed Ethan past his careful control. "Funny you mentioned the future," he said, his voice calm but cold enough that she looked up from her wine glass with narrowed eyes. "I've been thinking about it too. Specifically about whether we actually have one." The color drained from her face. Not completely. Mallory was too practiced at composure for that, but enough that he knew she'd caught the shift in his tone, the implication beneath his words. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" she asked carefully, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. "When the moment of truth arrives, does preparation make it easier, or just give you more time to imagine how badly it might go?" Ethan pulled his phone from his pocket and set it on the table between them, the screen still dark but the threat implicit. "I'm talking about honesty, Mallory. Something we've been short on lately in this marriage." She stared at the phone like it was a bomb, and in a way, it was. "I don't understand what you mean," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. The mask was starting to crack. He could see it in the way her eyes darted around the restaurant, calculating exits and witnesses, trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had just shifted decisively against her. "Let me help you understand," Ethan said, unlocking the phone with deliberate slowness. "I found the pregnancy test, Mallory, the one you hid in the bathroom trash 3 weeks ago." Her face went completely pale now, the red dress suddenly looking like a target painted on her. "I can explain," she started, but he cut her off with a raised hand. "Don't. Whatever you're about to say, whatever explanation you've rehearsed in case this moment came, save it. Because I've done more than find a pregnancy test. I've spent weeks investigating, following you, documenting everything." He tapped the phone screen and turned it toward her, the video from the clinic starting to play. The footage was clear, despite being shot through a car window. Mallory stepping out of her SUV, checking her phone, adjusting her dress. And then Luke appearing, the embrace, the intimate body language, the two of them walking into the clinic together like expectant parents. Mallory's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with something between horror and panic. Around them, other diners continued their meals, oblivious to the nuclear bomb detonating at the corner table. "That's Luke, right?" Ethan continued, his voice still eerily calm. "Senior consultant at Anderson Tech Group, married, 2 kids, lives out in Westlake. I've done my research, Mallory. I know everything. The coffee meetings that started in January, the expensive gifts you bought with our credit card, the prenatal appointment you scheduled without mentioning to your actual husband that you're pregnant." Each sentence landed like a physical blow, and he watched her armor crumble piece by piece. The confident, composed woman who'd been lying to his face for months was disappearing, replaced by someone desperate and cornered. "Ethan, please," she whispered, reaching for his hand. He pulled away from her touch like it burned. When confrontation finally happens, why does the truth feel less satisfying than you imagined it would? "You want to explain?" Ethan asked, leaning back in his chair with arms crossed. "Fine. Explain how you justified sleeping with a married man. Explain how you planned to pass his child off as mine. Explain how you looked me in the face every morning and lied without hesitation." Mallory's composure shattered completely. Tears started rolling down her carefully made-up face, mascara beginning to run. But Ethan felt nothing. No sympathy, no urge to comfort, just cold satisfaction at finally seeing her mask slip. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice breaking. "Luke and we just connected. You've been so distant, so buried in work. Don't you dare." Ethan interrupted, his voice rising enough that a couple at the next table glanced over. He lowered it again, but the steel remained. "Don't you dare try to make this about me being distant. You want to know why I was distant? Because every time I tried to be close to you, you pushed me away. Every advance rejected. Every attempt at intimacy shut down with some excuse. I gave you space because I thought you needed it. Thought you were stressed from work. Turns out you just needed space to screw your coworker." The words were harsh, deliberately so. He wanted her to feel even a fraction of the pain she'd inflicted on him over the past months. Mallory's tears came harder now, genuine distress replacing performative emotion. "Yes, I had an affair," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, the baby is Luke's. But Ethan, I never meant for it to go this far. It started as an escape. You were right here, but it felt like you were miles away. Luke made me feel seen, appreciated, exciting again. It wasn't about not loving you." "Save it." Ethan cut her off again. "I don't care about your rationalizations. I don't care about how Luke made you feel or what you think justified destroying our marriage. What I care about is that you lied repeatedly for months. You used our money to buy gifts for him. You scheduled doctor's appointments for his child. You were building an entire separate life while pretending everything at home was fine." He picked up the phone and pulled up another image. Luke's LinkedIn profile with his family photo prominently displayed. "Does Christine know?" he asked, showing her the picture. "Luke's wife? Does she know her husband is planning a second family with you?" Mallory's eyes widened. "Ethan, no. Please don't involve her. She has kids they don't deserve." "Deserve?" Ethan's laugh was bitter. "I didn't deserve to be betrayed either, but here we are. You made choices, Mallory. Now you get to live with the consequences. All of them. Is it wrong to want everyone touched by a betrayal to know the truth, even if it causes collateral damage?" The restaurant suddenly felt too small, too bright, too full of witnesses to his humiliation. Ethan stood abruptly, throwing his napkin on the table. "I want you out," he said flatly. "Tonight. Pack your things and leave. Go to Luke's house. Go to a hotel. Go wherever you want. But you're not staying in my house." Mallory looked up at him with genuine fear now. "Ethan, please. Can we just talk about this? Go home and discuss it rationally." The pleading in her voice might have moved him once, but not anymore. Not after weeks of deception and betrayal. "We're done talking," he said. "There's nothing left to discuss. You chose Luke. You chose this affair. You chose to get pregnant with another man's child. Those were your decisions, and now I'm making mine. Get out of my house. Get out of my life, and pray I don't make this situation even worse for you than it already is." He pulled out his wallet and threw cash on the table, enough to cover their barely touched meal and a generous tip, because he wasn't going to let Mallory's betrayal turn him into someone who stiffed service workers. Then he walked out of the restaurant without looking back, leaving her sitting alone at the table with tears streaming down her face and the wreckage of their marriage scattered around her like broken glass. The drive home felt surreal, like he was moving through someone else's life. Part of him, the part that had been married to Mallory for 5 years, wanted to turn around, to try to salvage something from this disaster. But the larger part, the part that had spent weeks being systematically lied to, knew there was nothing left to salvage. Trust, once shattered this completely, couldn't be repaired. And even if it could be, Ethan realized he didn't want to try. Mallory had shown him exactly who she was. Someone willing to betray the deepest intimacy for momentary excitement. Someone who could compartmentalize so effectively she'd planned prenatal appointments while making dinner conversation. Back home, he didn't wait to see if Mallory would follow his instructions to pack and leave. Instead, he went to his computer and composed an email to Christine Richardson, Luke's wife. He attached the clinic video, screenshots of the emails between Luke and Mallory, and a brief factual explanation of the situation. No emotional appeals, no requests for solidarity and betrayal, just information presented clearly and undeniably. "Your husband Luke has been having an affair with my wife Mallory," the email stated. "They're expecting a child together. I thought you should know." His finger hovered over the send button for only a moment before clicking. There. Done. Let Luke deal with the consequences of his actions too. When you've been betrayed, is it justice or revenge to ensure the other betrayer's spouse knows the truth? Ethan heard Mallory's SUV pull into the driveway around midnight. He was sitting in the darkened living room, laptop open, reviewing the documentation Sarah Martinez had told him to organize for divorce proceedings. The door opened tentatively, like she wasn't sure if she'd be physically thrown out. "Ethan?" she called softly. He didn't respond, just kept typing. She found him by the light of the laptop screen, her earlier makeup now completely destroyed by tears, still wearing that red dress that had started the evening with such different expectations. "I packed some things," she said, her voice small. "I'll stay with my sister in Round Rock for now. But Ethan, please, can we talk about this? Maybe go to counseling? I made a terrible mistake, but our marriage doesn't have to end." He finally looked up at her, and whatever she saw in his expression made her step back. "Our marriage ended months ago, Mallory. You ended it every time you met Luke for coffee, every time you lied about working late, every time you pushed me away so you could preserve your energy for him. I'm just finalizing the paperwork." His voice was cold, devoid of the anger that had fueled him earlier. Now there was just exhausted finality. "What did you do?" she asked suddenly, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "At the restaurant, you mentioned Luke's wife. Ethan, what did you do?" He smiled without humor. "I sent Christine all the evidence. The videos, the emails, everything. She has a right to know what her husband's been doing, don't you think? Just like I had a right to know what my wife was doing." Mallory's face went from pale to flushed with anger. "You had no right. Their marriage, their kids, that's not your business." The hypocrisy was stunning, and Ethan almost laughed. "My marriage was my business," he countered. "And Luke made it his business when he decided sleeping with you was worth destroying multiple families. Actions have consequences, Mallory. You're both about to learn that lesson thoroughly." She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw calculation behind her tears. She was already trying to figure out how to spin this, how to minimize damage, how to maintain some control. But it was too late. The dominoes were falling, and nothing she could do would stop them now. "I'll have my attorney contact yours," Ethan said, returning his attention to the laptop. "Take what you packed and go. Don't come back unless I explicitly tell you to. Why does it feel emptier to win a battle you never wanted to fight than to lose one you believed in?" Sunday morning brought an unexpected call. Christine Richardson, Luke's wife, her voice shaking with a mixture of fury and gratitude. "Is this Ethan?" she asked without preamble. He confirmed it was. "I got your email. I've been up all night looking at those videos, those messages. I confronted Luke an hour ago, and he admitted everything. Everything. The affair, the pregnancy, all of it." Her voice broke on the last word, and Ethan felt a pang of guilt, not for sending the email, but for being the messenger of such devastating news. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," he said, meaning it. "But you deserve to know the truth." Christine laughed, a bitter sound. "Sorry? Don't be sorry. I've been feeling crazy for months. Luke was distant, secretive with his phone, working late constantly. I thought maybe I was paranoid, making problems where there weren't any. You gave me validation, proof I wasn't imagining things. So thank you, actually." They talked for 20 minutes, comparing notes on their spouses' deceptions, finding grim solidarity in shared betrayal. Christine was filing for divorce immediately, she told him. She'd already called her attorney, already told her parents, already started the process of dismantling the life she'd thought was secure. After hanging up, Ethan felt something shift inside him, not relief exactly, but a loosening of the tight knot of anger that had been his constant companion for weeks. Christine's gratitude had been unexpected, and it reframed his actions from revenge into something more like justice. He'd given her information she needed to make informed decisions about her own life. That wasn't cruelty. That was respect for another person's right to truth. Whether the same could be said for publicly exposing Luke was debatable, but Ethan found he didn't particularly care about those ethical nuances anymore. Luke had made his choices. Now he was facing them. Monday brought another call, this one less welcome. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Luke's voice came through the phone, tight with barely controlled rage. Ethan had been expecting this. The confrontation from the other man, the attempt at intimidation or negotiation. He leaned back in his office chair at home, perfectly calm. "I'm cleaning up a mess," he replied evenly. "A mess you helped create. What exactly is your complaint, Luke? That I told your wife the truth about where you've been spending your time and who you've been spending it with?" Luke sputtered, trying to find footing in an argument he'd already lost. "You had no right to blow up my marriage. Christine and we could have worked through this privately. My kids didn't need to know their father. Your kids didn't need to know their father is a liar and a cheat," Ethan interrupted. "Interesting parenting philosophy, but let's be clear about something, Luke. You blew up your own marriage the moment you decided my wife was worth risking it for. I just made sure the truth came out. Don't blame me for consequences you created. This isn't over," Luke threatened, but there was no real heat behind it. Just the desperate bluster of a man watching his carefully constructed life crumble. "You're right," Ethan agreed. "It's not over. My attorney has all the evidence of the affair documented for divorce proceedings. That means it becomes part of public record. Your employer might find it interesting reading, given your position requires ethical conduct and trustworthiness. Your professional reputation is about to take the same hit as your personal one, so if I were you, I'd focus on damage control with your own family rather than making threats you can't back up." The line went silent for a moment, then Luke hung up without another word. Ethan set the phone down, feeling a grim satisfaction. Luke had thought he could have it all, the respectable family life and the exciting affair, without facing consequences. Reality, Ethan reflected, had a way of correcting that kind of arrogance. When does holding someone accountable cross the line into causing unnecessary destruction, or is that line even real? The following weeks unfolded with bureaucratic inevitability. Sarah Martinez filed divorce papers citing adultery, supported by what she cheerfully called a prosecutorial wet dream of evidence. Mallory's attorney tried to negotiate, arguing that Texas community property laws meant she deserved half of everything regardless of the affair. Sarah shut that down quickly, pointing out that judges had considerable discretion when adultery was proven, and no judge would look kindly on a woman who'd used marital funds to support an affair while pregnant with another man's child. Ethan threw himself into the mechanical process of separating a life. Bank accounts divided, assets cataloged, the house, which he'd brought into the marriage, secured firmly in his name. He felt oddly detached from it all, like he was processing someone else's divorce rather than his own. Friends reached out, having heard various versions of the story through Austin's interconnected social networks. Some were supportive, others awkwardly disappeared, not wanting to take sides or get involved in messy personal drama. Ethan found he didn't particularly care either way. His social life had taken a backseat to the marriage for years. Now he was rediscovering what life looked like without Mallory's constant presence. The one moment of vulnerability came unexpected on a Tuesday evening. He was cleaning out the garage, sorting through boxes of shared memories, photos from their honeymoon in Colorado, wedding gifts they'd never actually used, accumulated detritus of 5 years together. At the bottom of one box, he found a letter Mallory had written him during their engagement, before they'd moved to Austin together. In it, she'd talked about building a life together, about trust and partnership, about how she'd never felt safer with anyone than she did with him. The contrast between those words and her actions over the past months hit him like a physical blow. For the first time since finding the pregnancy test, Ethan felt the anger crack open to reveal something underneath. Genuine grief. Not for Mallory as she was now, but for the person he'd thought she was, the marriage he'd believed they had. He sat on the garage floor surrounded by boxes and let himself feel the full weight of that loss. The betrayal hurt, yes, but the deeper pain was recognizing how thoroughly he'd been deceived about something he'd believed was real and solid. After 20 minutes, he pulled himself together, threw the letter in the trash, and went back to sorting boxes. Grief was natural, he told himself, but it didn't change the facts. The woman who'd written that letter if she'd ever really existed, was gone. Is it possible to mourn what you thought you had without giving power back to the person who destroyed it? May arrived with typical Austin intensity. Temperatures pushing 90, the city filling with tourists drawn by music festivals and tech conferences. Ethan had started rebuilding his life in small, deliberate ways. He reconnected with Greg, a college friend who'd moved to Austin years ago, and who Ethan had gradually lost touch with during the marriage. They met for beers at a place on Rainy Street, and Greg listened to the whole story without interruption. "Man, that's brutal," Greg said when Ethan finished. "But honestly, Mallory always struck me as someone playing a role. I never felt like I was seeing the real person." The observation startled Ethan because it confirmed something he'd been reluctant to admit to himself. Other people had seen what he'd missed or ignored. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. Greg shrugged. "What was I going to say? Hey buddy, I think your wife might be fake. You were happy, or at least you seemed happy. Who was I to throw doubt on that?" They talked until midnight, and Ethan realized how much he'd isolated himself during the marriage, how many friendships he'd let atrophy because Mallory hadn't particularly liked his friends or wanted to spend time with them. He picked up his guitar again, an old Gibson that had been gathering dust in a closet for years. His fingers were clumsy at first, muscle memory degraded by neglect, but gradually the old skills returned. He started running in the mornings, using the time to process thoughts and emotions without the numbing distraction of screens or work. The physical activity helped. The endorphins, the sense of accomplishment, the simple discipline of showing up and doing the work. He'd let himself become soft during the marriage, he realized. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Mallory's betrayal had been a wake-up call in more ways than one. The divorce proceedings moved toward finalization with surprising speed. Mallory had initially fought for more money, more assets, more consideration for her situation, but her attorney had finally convinced her that fighting was pointless given the evidence. They settled on terms heavily weighted in Ethan's favor. He kept the house, the bulk of their savings, and his retirement accounts intact. Mallory got her car, some furniture, and enough money to get established somewhere else. Generous, Sarah noted, given how Texas law could have left her with much less. "You're being decent," Sarah observed during their final meeting. "More decent than she deserves." Ethan nodded. "I'm not trying to destroy her. I just want her out of my life. When you've won everything you wanted in a divorce, why does it still feel like everyone lost?" June brought news through the social media grapevine that Mallory had left Austin entirely, relocating to Dallas for a job opportunity, and presumably to escape the wreckage of her reputation. Ethan felt nothing hearing this. No satisfaction, no sadness, just a vague sense that a chapter had closed. Luke, meanwhile, was apparently still in Austin but living separately from Christine, seeing his kids on weekends while navigating his own divorce. Their affair, the great passion that had justified destroying 2 marriages, had apparently fizzled out under the weight of consequences and reality. Turns out forbidden excitement loses its appeal when it's no longer forbidden. Ethan's house, his house now, fully and legally, felt different. He'd rearranged furniture, repainted the bedroom a color he actually liked, cleared out all traces of Mallory's presence. It was smaller now in some ways, one person's life instead of 2, but it also felt more authentically his. He hosted Greg and some other friends for a low-key gathering on his back patio, grilling steaks and drinking beer while the sun set over the neighborhood. "This place looks good," Greg observed. "You look good too. Better than you have in years, honestly." Ethan realized it was true. Despite the trauma of the past months, or perhaps because of it, he felt more grounded than he had in a long time. He'd started seeing a therapist, something Sarah had recommended during the divorce process. Initially skeptical, Ethan had found the sessions surprisingly helpful, not in a dramatic breakthrough sense, but in providing tools for processing betrayal without letting it define him going forward. "You're angry," his therapist, Dr. Kim, observed during one session. "That's natural and healthy. The question is whether that anger is serving you or controlling you." Ethan had to admit it was probably a bit of both. The anger had motivated him to stand up for himself, to demand truth and accountability. But it had also consumed months of his life, driven decisions that, while justified, had carried their own costs. "I exposed Luke to his wife," Ethan said during one session, still wrestling with whether that had been the right choice. "I sent her evidence of the affair. Was that justice or revenge?" Dr. Kim considered the question carefully. Can it be both? She asked. You gave Christine information she needed to make informed decisions about her marriage. That's respect for her autonomy. But you also did it to hurt Luke, to make him face consequences. Those motivations can coexist. The question is whether you can live with that complexity. Ethan decided he could. He'd made choices based on the information and emotions available to him at the time. They weren't perfect choices, and they'd caused collateral damage, but they'd also restored truth to situations built on deception. That had to count for something. Can you act from mixed motives, some noble, some petty, and still end up having done the right thing? By August, the legal formalities were complete. The divorce was final, assets divided, Mallory officially out of his life except for the occasional financial detail that needed resolving. Ethan celebrated by taking a solo road trip to Big Bend, something he'd wanted to do for years, but Mallory had always dismissed as too remote, too rugged, not her style. He spent 5 days hiking through desert canyons, camping under stars so bright they seemed artificial, sitting with silence in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The solitude was cleansing, not in some mystical sense, but in the simple reality of being alone with his thoughts without distraction or performance. He thought about Mallory out there, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to during the angry months of documentation and divorce. Not with bitterness or longing, but with something closer to anthropological curiosity. What had driven her to such elaborate deception? Was it boredom, as she'd claimed, some fundamental character flaw? Or had they simply been wrong for each other in ways neither had recognized until the mismatch manifested as betrayal? He'd probably never know, and increasingly, he found he didn't need to. Understanding her motivations wouldn't change what had happened or make the betrayal hurt less. It was just information he didn't actually need. What he did need was to figure out what came next. At 36, Ethan found himself single in Austin's chaotic dating scene. His last serious relationship before Mallory having been in his 20s. The landscape had changed. Apps dominated. Expectations felt different. The whole process seemed exhausting in a way it hadn't before. But beneath the surface-level anxiety about dating logistics was a deeper question. What did he actually want from partnership now? The marriage to Mallory had been comfortable, conventional, built on assumptions about what adult life was supposed to look like. Now those assumptions felt suspect. Maybe he needed something different, or maybe he needed to be alone for longer than a few months. There was no rush, he reminded himself. Rebuilding a life wasn't a race. Back in Austin, he focused on work with renewed energy, took on projects he'd been avoiding, reconnected with colleagues and clients he'd neglected. His boss noticed the difference. "Whatever's going on with you, keep doing it," she said after a particularly successful product launch. "You're sharper than you've been in years." Ethan didn't tell her about the divorce. It wasn't relevant to work, but he knew she was right. The mental energy he'd been pouring into maintaining a false marriage was now available for things that actually mattered. In a strange way, Mallory's betrayal had freed him from a situation that had been slowly suffocating him without him fully realizing it. The cost had been brutal, but the outcome was worth it. When betrayal forces you to rebuild from scratch, do you reconstruct what you had or use the opportunity to build something entirely new? September marked 6 months since Ethan had found the pregnancy test, half a year since the discovery that had upended everything. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Mallory had given birth to a boy in early August, that she and Luke were no longer in contact, that she was navigating single motherhood in Dallas with help from her family. Ethan felt a distant sympathy for the child born into such complicated circumstances, but it was abstract. The boy wasn't his responsibility, wasn't connected to his life except through the accident of his mother's choices. His own life had found a rhythm. Weekend runs had become a habit. Guitar playing had progressed from rusty scales to actual songs. Friendships had deepened through consistent investment. He'd started dating casually, nothing serious, just coffee meetings and dinner conversations with women he met through friends or apps. The process felt awkward initially, explaining his situation without dumping emotional baggage on essential strangers, but he got better at it. "I'm recently divorced," became his standard opener. "My ex-wife had an affair. I'm still processing it, but I'm ready to meet new people." Most women appreciated the directness. One evening in late September, while having dinner with a woman named Rachel who worked in environmental consulting, she asked him what he'd learned from the experience. It was a bold question for a second date, but Ethan appreciated the directness. "I learned that trust is everything," he said after thinking for a moment. Not blind trust, but the kind built on consistent honesty and follow-through. I ignored warning signs in my marriage because I wanted to believe everything was fine. I won't make that mistake again. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. That's mature. A lot of people come out of situations like yours either bitter or naive. You seem to have found middle ground. He hoped she was right. The anniversary of the discovery came and went without much fanfare. Ethan marked it privately, acknowledging how far he'd come while recognizing how much work remained. Betrayal leaves scars, Dr. Kim had told him, and scars don't fully disappear. They just become part of your story. He was learning to live with his scars, to see them not as weaknesses but as evidence of survival. Mallory had tried to destroy him, maybe not intentionally, but through the accumulated weight of her deceptions. She'd failed. He was still here, still building, still moving forward. That felt like victory enough. After surviving betrayal, what matters more? The justice you extracted or the life you built afterward? So here's what Ethan learned from having his marriage imploded by a pregnancy test hidden in bathroom trash. Betrayal reveals character, both in the betrayer and the betrayed. Mallory showed him who she really was, someone capable of elaborate deception, someone who valued excitement over integrity, someone willing to build a future on foundations of lies. And Ethan showed himself who he could be, strategic rather than explosive, demanding accountability rather than accepting comfortable fictions, willing to face uncomfortable truths and act on them. But the real lesson, the one that took months to crystallize, wasn't about Mallory or even about betrayal specifically. It was about the danger of living on autopilot, of accepting a relationship's surface appearance without questioning what lay underneath. Ethan had been so focused on being a good husband, providing financially, being supportive, not making waves, that he'd stopped paying attention to whether they actually had a real partnership. The intimacy had dried up, communication had become shallow, genuine connection had been replaced by comfortable routine. Those facts didn't excuse Mallory's affair, but they explained how it became possible. She'd found exit ramps he hadn't noticed she was looking for. The question now, for Ethan and for anyone who's survived similar betrayals, is how to move forward without becoming cynical. How do you rebuild trust in people generally without becoming paranoid? How do you stay open to genuine connection while also maintaining healthy boundaries? There's no easy answer, but Ethan's approach had been to focus on actions rather than words, consistency rather than declarations, demonstrated character rather than promised commitment. It made dating slower, more cautious, but it also felt authentic in a way his marriage never had. To anyone listening who's discovered a hidden pregnancy test or secret emails, or any of the 1,000 ways betrayal announces itself, you have choices. You can explode immediately, you can stay and try to rebuild, you can leave quietly, or you can do what Ethan did: document, strategize, and then act from a position of strength rather than weakness. None of these choices is wrong, but they produce different outcomes. Ethan chose confrontation and exposure, choices that felt right for him but might not work for everyone. The key is making conscious decisions rather than reactive ones, understanding that you're choosing not just how to handle the immediate crisis, but what kind of person you want to be on the other side of it. So what about you? If you discovered your partner's deepest betrayal tomorrow, how would you respond? Would you have the discipline Ethan showed? Or would emotion override strategy? Would you want revenge, justice, or just escape? And perhaps most importantly, what warning signs are you ignoring right now in your own relationships? The truth is, most betrayals don't come out of nowhere. They're usually preceded by months or years of smaller deceptions, ignored red flags, and eroded intimacy. Pay attention, ask questions, demand honesty, and be honest in return. Because the alternative is finding your own version of that pregnancy test and dealing with the explosion that follows. If this story made you think, if it challenged you or gave you something to reflect on, I'd appreciate you subscribing to this channel and hitting that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. We all know people navigating complicated relationships, people who might benefit from Ethan's experience. Leave a comment about your own perspective on betrayal and accountability. And if you truly enjoyed this story and want to support this work, please buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. Even the smallest contribution makes a real difference so stories like this can keep being told. Thanks for listening. Stay sharp, stay honest, and don't settle for comfortable lies when uncomfortable truth is available.